When you think of regulation, what is the first thing you think of? My guess is it's something like one of these agencies, executive order statutes, and so forth. Well, I don't want you to think of any of those first. Rather, I want you to think of nature. I'll explain. Much, and until about a century ago, most societal regulation emerged organically. How we interact with our families, our friends, our notions of child rearing, the sports we play, even the side of the street that we drive on is all emergent organically, driven by cooperation primarily to avoid conflict and for mutual benefit. Such customs and norms evolve continuously. For example, the pill increased public acceptance of non-marital sex with no top-down control or driving of that. Similarly, phone calls frequencies were reduced thanks to texting. Such organic regulation of societies and economies is inescapable. We see that in totalitarian states where forbidden languages and underground or black markets still arise. And as Nobel laureate in economics Vernon Smith showed us, even property rights, trade, and markets can emerge spontaneously, as with customs and norms. Organic regulation long predates humanity. We see it in wolves, chickens, and, for example, eels defending their territory. Now, also emergent is common law. What do I mean by that? Common law traces its history back to the Magna Carta. It is open-ended. It does not try to anticipate all the problems that may arise. Rather, it simply addresses each conflict, or dispute as it arises. It is real world and grounded in the real world. It uses the reasonable person or reasonable man principle or standard, which is what would a reasonable person who lives in this jurisdiction consider the most reasonable resolution to this dispute. It varies continuously through different decisions of lower courts and then selection by higher courts, so you can see that evolves continuously. This is, it seems to me, a best kept secret, and that is until about a century ago, the United States and UK were primarily common law countries. 60 former British colonies and protectorates have inherited common law traditions, including all the ones listed here. So customs, markets, and common law regulate economies and societies organically. By having many decision makers, it makes for a robust ecosystem, which is hard to corrupt. Now, like rainforests, coral reefs, and the human brain, societies and economies are complex adaptive systems. They're complex. Order arises bottom up from lots of interactions of agents. They're never at equilibrium. They're dynamic, and because they have nonlinear and chaotic elements, they're unpredictable. They're adaptive. They adjust to external shocks and imposed constraints. Now, in contrast to common law, the European powers have primarily inherited civil law traditions, and their former colonies, all of the ones listed here. Civil laws, statutes, regulations, and executive orders are imposed from the top down by legislatures, parliaments, agencies, presidents, and dictators. Common law originated in Roman times, got a big boost in the early 19th century with French Napoleonic Code, which spread it throughout Europe. And it is the legal regime of choice for politicians and despots worldwide. On top of organic regulation resides this layer of imposed regulation, statutes, regulations, and executive orders. These evolve not continuously, but through, at irregular intervals through amendments, negotiating, horse trading by legislators. They tend to accumulate. And because there is a central decision-making body, there's a single point of failure, and thus they're vulnerable to corruption. An example of organic regulation, supply and demand; of imposed regulation, wage and price controls. Now, given all those disadvantages, why statutes or civil law and imposed regulations? Well, they do have some advantages. They're more predictable, at least in the short term. Because in common law, different judges and juries may reach different conclusions. With civil law, it's black and white. There's efficiency benefits, and there's uniformity across jurisdictions that civil law brings. Until a century ago, most civil law simply codified common law, was simply a codification of common law, and common law thus restrained civil law from overreaching. If you're familiar with the exploration-exploitation model, which is used throughout the social sciences, basically a learning model, the exploration informs the exploitation. Common law served as the learning or the discovery or the exploitation for civil law's exploitation or scaling up. But civil law has public choice concerns, all of the ones listed here. The officials can leverage civil law to get reelected, to retain power. They can use it to protect favored businesses and industries for their own benefit or for those of their cronies. They can enable agencies to empower themselves, civil laws do, and generate revenue for them, insulate the agencies from risk. And all of this is exacerbated by the fact that there are so many human impulses to create law, to demonstrate power, to have a sense of accomplishment, we did something, or to signal virtue. U.S. civil law has supplanted common law over the last century in the ways shown by these arrows. In two ways, as legislation, especially federal, has imposed on more and more private matters, and as regulatory and criminal enforcement have grown. Common law is truly a tragedy of the commons. It has no advocacy nor constituency at all. Like a commons, there's no one who benefits by specifically who benefits from it, as is the case by promoting a civil law that works to your benefit. In the words of Hayek, we are deselecting for common law in the evolutionary sense. However, common law has some empirical advantages, all of the ones listed here. And there's a body of economic research called legal origins research, which shows that countries that have inherited common law traditions enjoy these benefits over those that have primarily inherited civil law traditions. And of course, every country today uses a mix of the two. It's just a question of how much. And this study shows that common law countries have enjoyed 0.5% per year greater growth in GDP per capita over the last 2.5 centuries than civil law countries. And indeed, if you look at North and South America, the GDP per capita of North and South are as shown here. And it's a factor of 4.4. And if you raise slightly more than 0.5% to the 250th power, representing the last 2.5 centuries, you get approximately that same ratio. I could go on, but what are our conclusions? One, before creating new laws, first, let neighbors attempt to resolve their own disputes. Two, empower courts to seek the best resolutions for litigants. And three, ask how might imposing law undermine society's organic regulation, customs, markets, and common laws. Two, next, treat every law as a trial experiment of limited scope and duration. That is, incorporate a sunset clause. laws that reflect real-world case consensus from common law cases are most likely to have the fewest unintended consequences. And before laws are renewed, conduct post-mortem reviews of their costs and effectiveness. And finally, be intellectually humble in legislating, because societies and economies are chaotic, complex, and exhibit unintended consequences. Thanks so much. This QR code will take you to a much more detailed article discussing this. Yes, Brad.
So regulations all have costs.
Yes.
Is there any analysis of whether the costs of common law derived regulation are higher or lower than the costs of civil code regulation?
Costs of common law regulation. So the costs are the network of courts throughout the jurisdiction.
No, what I mean is that if a court makes a ruling defining a standard of care,
yes,
everyone has to now follow that standard of care. There may be a cost for everyone to follow that standard of care. Like the tax code has a huge cost in accounting and everything. These are the costs I'm talking about.
Well, I don't know of any specific studies of the costs of common law. There are lots of studies of the cost of civil law, as you know, statutes, regulations, and so forth. And my guess is most of the studies of civil law use common law as the baseline, because what would emerge from common law is really basic. Common law, as I said, doesn't attempt to set policy. It simply attempts to find the best resolution for outcomes. Yes?
Is there any analysis of like non-Western laws, let's say Islamic, Judaic, Confucian, within this framework?
Is there any is there any study of non-Western law?
Yeah, in its implications as well.
David Friedman has studied all kinds of legal traditions, and generally found. Here's one data point: the highest growth country in the world from 1965 to 1995 was Botswana in Africa, 7.7% per year. GDP per capita growth over 3 decades. They inherited 2 forms of organic regulation. One was their traditional tribal law, and 2 was British common law. It was a British protectorate prior to their getting their independence in 1965, and this combination, Britain ruled it very gently and gave stature to their tribal structure and law, and that just enabled them to take off phenomenally after they gained independence.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.